Good evening, everyone. This is Wayne over at the Alchemical Tech Revolution YouTube channel. Tonight, we're going to look at a little book from Amnesty International called Report on Torture, Revised Edition. And this is the second edition released in 1975. The first edition of this was printed in 1973. And as we go on, it will become abundantly clear why we're looking at something like this here tonight. Especially as it relates to events going on today. So we're going to get right in here and just get started with this. And I'm going to go down to page 41 in the book here to Chapter 1, a portion of Chapter 1, which is medical and psychological aspects of torture. And we're going to start reading from here, and we'll go through. And as we move along, you'll see why I decided that it's important that we cover this tonight. All right, so let's get started. Torture as a stress. In human terms, a stress is any event which changes or threatens to change the stability of one's environmental, physical, or mental well-being. The majority of the stresses applied to an individual are easily dealt with by inherited and acquired defense processes. Just as a physical assault may be warded off by a movement of the forearm, so a verbal assault may be dismissed by a laugh or a contemptuous reply. These defense factors, which enable us to survive stress, are keenly studied and cultivated by the military establishment in the training of soldiers, and they are studied with equal keenness by torture technicians and by torture resistance training groups. In order to understand the nature and function of these stress survival factors, it will be necessary to outline briefly the characteristics of stress itself. Stresses are customarily divided into three categories: the acute, short-lived, the subacute, medium-term, and the chronic, long-standing. The response to each stress type differs accordingly. In acute stress, a sudden reflex, primitive fight-or-flight response occurs. The brain becomes alert, the heart beats faster, the blood vessels to the skin constrict to divert more blood to the brain and muscles, the adrenal glands secrete adrenaline and corticosteroids into the blood. A state of maximal arousal results. If the acute stress is intolerable, a paradoxal situation may result. In such circumstances, the subject may vomit, become paralyzed by fear, faint, or even fall asleep. The subacute response is a reaction to a more prolonged stress, marked by anxiety or excitement, i.e., moderate cerebral arousal, with noticeable alterations in sleep, appetite, and libido. However, the subject retains confidence in his ability to cope and maintain his integrity and morale. Even if the stress includes the threat of death, he retains a fighting posture and does not expect disaster. This level of stress resistance is particularly reinforced during military training, since it is critical to the endurance of continuing adverse stress. If resistance factors at this level are absent or destroyed, an accelerated transition to the final chronic phase can be expected. Although the chronic behavioral response to severe stress would radically impair one's ability to live in a quote-unquote normal, low-stress society, it is often essential for self-preservation in extreme pressure situations. A continuous state of anxiety may develop, often with profound depression of mood and pessimism in outlook. Thought processes, bodily desires, and functions become retarded. In this state, external stresses produce little distress, the body and mind being already maximally distressed. As in acute stresses, a paradoxical situation may occur in which the victim develops a condition of total denial, such as a hysterical fugue. He appears to switch off all awareness, looks bland and untroubled, exhibits no response to pain. His memory or voice may be lost. He may lie apparently paralyzed. It is as though the mind, being too overstimulated, tripped its relays or blew a fuse and ceased to recognize any bodily or sensory stimuli. In those who cannot retire into either of these two main responses, the mind may give up living. Wartime experience is full of cases of individuals who expose themselves to being shot. A fatal injury was apprehended as a merciful release. A non-fatal wound offered a ticket to a base hospital. Although this was sometimes done deliberately, it was usually subconscious, in that overstressed men became accident-prone. At other times, death came by suicide, or by just not eating and lying down to die, as occurred in the more rigorous prison camps in World War II. Giving up could also take other forms. Men became susceptible to illnesses like bronchopneumonia, to psychosomatic diseases such as duodenal ulcers, asthma, and bronchitis, to coronary disease, TB, and even to cancer. It is evident, therefore, that from the point of view of resistance to war stress and torture stress, it is the factors which impede the transition from the subacute response to the chronic response, i.e. from fight to flight, that are critical. It is precisely in this area that military conditioning seeks to reinforce individuals and that torture seeks to break them down. Before analyzing the mechanisms of eroding subacute stress resistance, it is important first to deal with two popular misconceptions. Excuse me for a second there, folks. It's got to clear my throat. Interesting stuff so far, isn't it, guys? We're looking at how many of these stresses are related to, respiratory illness, for one thing. Let's continue on. During the passage of the wars from the American Civil War through to Vietnam, two erroneous notions were abolished. The first is that by assessment of a man's previous personality, one can predict his endurance under stress. People with previous neurotic illness and social misfits who were unable to cope in normal environments often did better than those with a clearly normal, in quotes, personality. It was noted at one time that in psychiatric battle, casualties, about 50%, had a poor previous personality, and vigorous recruiting screening procedures were introduced, including a U.S. Navy World War I program that classified swearing and masturbation as reasons for exclusion. It was not until later that it was noted that psychiatric casualties had, on average, served longer than the physical casualties, and that 50% of highly decorated aircrew also had a poor previous personality. The second fallacy is that given strength of character, one can survive life-threatening stress indefinitely. In World War II in the Mediterranean area, it was noted that men who survived physically unscathed for 100, 200, or even 300 days of continuous frontline fighting became mentally disturbed, and without eating or sleeping, continued to fight like automata and had to be forcibly removed from the battlefield for rest and psychiatric treatment. It is significant, furthermore, that the Code of Conduct for members of the Armed Forces of the United States was altered at the conclusion of the Korean War to take into account the fact that almost all prisoners of war in the past had divulged information to their interrogators, regardless of rigid orders to the contrary. The Secretary of Defense's Advisory Committee, which drafted the revised code, concluded, "It is recognized that the POW may be subjected to an extreme of coercion beyond his ability to resist. If in his battle with his interrogator he is driven from his first line of resistance, i.e. name, rank, serial number, and date of birth only, he must be trained for resistance in successive positions. The best and most commonplace resistance to pain and stress, whether of a high or low intensity, is the simple denial that it is either a potent pain or stress, or even that it is a pain or stress at all. This denial may be either culturally or individually generated. For example, many types of stress, such as severe physical exercises, are regarded as character building in some educational environments. The removal of a fingernail by a surgeon, although uncomfortable, is patiently borne in the knowledge that it will produce relief of pain and the return to normal health. On a general level, if one believes that the endurance of physical punishment on earth grants one a short stay in purgatory and more certain heavenly reward after death, pain may be endured gladly. Similarly, if one has faith in a cause such as the defense of freedom or is committed to a revolutionary struggle, pain and death are simply prices that must be paid for victory. Morale may be compounded by feelings of patriotism, comradeship, or justice, of personal feelings, of emotional security, or hatred or aggression toward someone's antagonizer. It may be supported by little things, by a ray of sunlight, by food and sleep, by news from home, or even from accounts of solitary confinement, by a bond of love with tiny creatures such as mosquitoes. As long as an individual in a severe and sustained stress situation manages to preserve this compensatory morale, he cannot be said to have entered the chronic response phase. The aim of the torturer-interrogator is therefore to erode that morale by destroying whatever props the individual has for his mental integrity. Excuse me again. Let's continue on here. It gets more interesting from here, folks. This means that the victim must believe that he is being tortured before the excessive stress state of torture can be said to begin. He must believe that the stress is malevolent. The pulling off of a fingernail in the course of coercive interrogation or the insertion of needles into the quick is a horrendous experience, and the pain is dramatically different from that experienced in the benevolent surgical context. Furthermore, it should be noted that the stress has to be correct culturally to be recognized as a torture. For example, many sophisticated Caucasians believe that pentothal is a truth drug, and that if injected with it, one cannot help giving a true and complete response to every question. It is this belief alone which gives the drug its reputation. If one believes a substance to be a drug with a specific effect, there is a 40% chance of that effect occurring, even if a totally inert substance is used, the placebo effect. The same sophisticated Caucasian who tells all when given an injection of distilled water, believing it to be a truth drug, would probably laugh if a voodoo spell said to have the same result were cast on him. The reverse could be reasonably expected of a Haitian peasant. In the context of political repression, of course, these essential features of malevolence and appropriateness are inherent in the torture interrogation situation. Therefore, the first object of the torturer-interrogator is to weaken the compensatory morale and habitual defenses of the victim. Commonly, this is achieved initially through systematic debilitation of the detainees. Not surprisingly, methods are relatively universal: semi-starvation, exposure, exploitation of wounds, induced illness. Just putting it there, folks. Sleep deprivation, lack of proper hygiene, prolonged interrogation under extreme tension, prolonged constraint, forced writing, and fatiguing physical exercises. The debilitation procedure is to introduce the corollary of the principle, a healthy mind in a healthy body. Damaging the anatomical and physiological components of body function progressively impairs the working of the brain and hastens the collapse of will and morale. Starvation deprives the brain of energy to work. Malnutrition with vitamin B deficiency deprives the brain of coenzymes necessary for normal cerebral metabolism. Sleep deprivation is scarcely understood but produces gross disturbance in higher cortical functioning. Electroencephalograms clearly indicate that sleep deprivation results in a progressive increase in dreaming frequency, and if sleep is prevented, dreams appear to occur in the waking state, resulting in disordered perception and hallucinations. There are two theories of the functions of this breakdown process: the quote-unquote brain syndrome theory and the stress theory. Each includes the other as a subsidiary influence. In his systematic study of the induced debility of the interrogation subject, Hinkle states that the aim of the physical breakdown is to achieve an impairment of all those aspects of brain function that are commonly tested when the physician undertakes to assess the mental status of the patient. A patient exhibiting this syndrome can no longer carry on his usual complex activities, assume his daily responsibilities, or cope with interpersonal relations. As its symptoms develop, he may become restless, talkative, and delirious. Information derived from past experience generally becomes less potent as a guide for action, whereas information derived from the immediate experience, pain, thirst, discomfort, and threats to life become more potent. Chalice, while suggesting that Hinkle's concept cannot account completely for the effectiveness of The procedure acknowledges that the brain syndrome aspects are relevant. The inability to think properly would itself produce stress. It would prevent the prisoner thinking of means to cope with stress and would make him easier to interrogate. It is an important part of a positive feedback stress-producing process. Pay attention there, folks. Feedback. Here we go with the cybernetic angle on everything again. This is what they're all about. They're all about this cybernetics approach to things. They look at this feedback and they use it. And let's continue on here and see what else this says. The second major theory of the breakdown process is proposed by Sargant. He offers a comparison with combat exhaustion, as recorded by Swank and Marchland, and argues that the breakdown is simply due to the effect of stress. After a period of about 50 days of continuous combat, the soldiers would become easily startled and confused, irritable, and would over-respond to all stimuli. Does that not sound familiar, folks? Continuous. This is continuous stress, easily startled and confused, irritable, over-responding to all stimuli. Where have we seen that recently? Back to the reading here. This state of hyperreactivity was followed insidiously by another group of symptoms referred to as emotional exhaustion. The men became dull and listless. They became mentally and physically retarded, preoccupied, and had increasing difficulty remembering details. This was accompanied by indifference and apathy. In such cases, bizarre contradictory behavior could occur. Apathy, folks. Where do we see apathy? Gee, I wonder what's going on here today. I wonder how this relates to things going on in the world today. Why am I reading this? Let's continue on. The simplest manifestation of this breakdown process as a result of torture was recorded after the Korean War. In its examination of methods of forceful indoctrination, hey, there's an important word, indoctrination, the Group for the Advancement of Psychiatry points out that during the Korean War, a particularly effective means of inducing pain and fatigue was to subject a prisoner to prolonged interrogation while forcing him to remain in a standing position. Other variants were to make him sit in a sitting position without a chair or stool, etc., or to hold up heavy objects, books. And just as my personal aside here, folks, to maybe stand on an X 6 feet behind somebody else in a line for hours on end. That might be considered to be of the same variant of one of these type things. Anyway, with my personal notes there aside, let's continue reading. The group points out the advantages of this form of deliberate torture for the interrogator. The immediate source of pain is not the interrogator, but the victim himself. The contest becomes, in a way, one of the individual against himself. Acting thus against himself makes the prisoner feel that the interrogator has greater powers, e.g. refusal to comply, can mean that the interrogator can resort to overt violence, and the interrogator can say that no one laid a hand on the prisoner, thus giving the interrogator the sense that he is acting legally. The logical extension of this passive disordering and debilitating torture is the application of sensory deprivation techniques. A vast amount of research has been carried out in the field, and there is a fairly general pattern of findings. Typical of the bibliography of experts in this field is a program cited by Lord Gardner in his minority report submitted with the report of the Committee of Privy Councillors appointed to consider authorized procedures for the interrogation of persons suspected of terrorism, presented to the British Parliament in March of 1972. Let's pause here for a second and take a look at what this says up here. The logical extension of this passive disordering and debilitating torture is the application of sensory deprivation techniques. So they're calling this a form of passive torture. This is passive torture. Keep that in mind. So they're not actually directly doing things that you might equate to what you would normally think of as torture. This is a passive means. This is a psychological means of torture. So let's keep that in mind, and we'll continue on with the reading now. In an experiment in England, fully described in the Lancet of 12 September 1959, 20 men and women volunteer members of a hospital staff, aged between 20 and 55 were each placed in a silent room standardized up to a mean sound pressure level difference of 80 decibels. And the further sensory deprivation consisted of having to wear translucent goggles which cut out patterned vision and padded fur gauntlets. On the other hand, they had 4 normal meals a day when they were visited by colleagues on the hospital staff and could take off the goggles, and they had Dunlow pillow mattresses on which they could sleep or rest, or they could walk about. They were promised an amount of paid time off equal to that spent in the room and were asked to stay there for as long as they could. 6 remained for 48, 51, 75, 82, and 92 hours, but 14 of the 20 gave up after less than 48 hours, 2 of them after only 5 hours. The usual causes being unbearable anxiety, tension, or attacks of panic. Dreams were invariable in those who slept for any length of time, and in a quarter of the 20 included nightmares of which drowning, suffocation, killing people, etc. were features. These were the results, although they were volunteers in their own hospital who knew that there was no reason for any panic, and who were not submitted to any wall standing or deprived of any food or sleep. Shawless, in his discussion of the application of sensory deprivation research in the Ulster depth interrogation techniques, makes a statement critical to an understanding of the real implications of SD in a torture context. And they're calling SD, that's the abbreviation they're using for sensory deprivation here. So let's read his quote here now. If we turn to people undergoing SD in a non-experimental situation, where the situation would be phenomenologically very different, the stressful nature of SD becomes even more apparent. In the Ulster situation, the internees had a thick black bag over their heads, were subject to a loud masking noise, had to remain in a fatiguing and painful fixed position while dressed in a boiler suit. Sleep was prevented and food was inadequate. Thus, cognitive functioning would be impaired. Pain would be present both from beatings and from the use of the stoica position at the wall. Finally, anxiety must have been at a high level for the internees even before the sensory deprivation began, especially as no one knew that they were to be arrested and subjected to the depersonalization and disorientation of the arrest and initial imprisonment process. Thus, one would expect the positive feedback process, there's feedback again, folks, to operate starting from an initially high level of stress, with cognitive functioning impaired so that rational defenses would be impossible. And we'll pause there for a moment, folks. That's interesting, and that is from, I guess, this gentleman named Shawless, who also studied this, and it just goes to show you what kinds of people are involved with these kind of things. It's just terrible to think about some of this stuff, but we're looking at this for a reason, and it's going to become very apparent here within the next couple of paragraphs. So let's get back to the reading. The testimonies of released internees support Shawless's suggestion. Testified 1, I heard strange noises, screams, and my only desire was to end all this pain and confusion by killing myself. This I tried to do in my thoughts by striking my head on a pipe, but without success. When an individual's basic stability is threatened in such a manner, he adopts various maneuvers to relieve the stress. For example, if an unpleasant thing happens to someone, he tells a friend about it, and some of its unpleasantness disappears. A group of prisoners may sustain each other by talking or making jokes about their experiences, or by talking or singing about other things which distract their minds. This letting off steam is limited, of course, to the stresses that are recognized and the fears which are named. Sedman points out that the failure of the prisoner to recognize the sources of the compulsion he experiences in the interrogation situation intensifies their effects, particularly the disabling effects of guilt reactions. You hear that, folks? Guilt reactions. Where do we see that going on? Did you wear your mask today? Let's get back to the reading. But even the release which comradeship affords is denied the prisoner who is isolated. Deprived of company and kept in suspense as to his fate, the victim begins to experience a lowering of his breaking point. He may become so tense and anxious just waiting that he will develop a chronic stress response behavior pattern. Boredom, too, contributes to the spiral of stress, which is unrelieved in many instances by any physical exercise. Prevented from taking physical exercise, the victim is deprived of another basic way of dealing with distress, and if this reaches severe proportions, he may actually welcome the physical aspect of torture and use it as his safety valve. Excuse me, had to clear my throat there. Back to the reading. As in the testimony of the Ulster internee, I tried to strike my head on a pipe. Soldiers in World War I, subjected to extreme stress, found enormous relief when wounded. Severely distressed psychiatric patients may injure themselves and become calm after cutting their wrists, for example, and it is thought that peptic ulcers in highly stressed individuals are a way, albeit subconscious, in which we can transmute unacceptable mental stresses into unacceptable physical distress. It is because of this self-regulating protective potential of the human organism that torturers and interrogators, to be effective at all, cannot rely solely on accumulating stress to mold the behavior of a detainee or interrogation subject. To do this requires considerable manipulation of the subject's behavior. It is to that we now turn. All right, pay attention here, folks. This is where the rubber meets the road with this stuff, okay? This is where we're going to see, one for one, what's going on with our society today. Let's get back to the reading. The next section here is called Manipulation and Resistance. It is the transition from the subacute to the chronic stress response that the torturer seeks to orchestrate, initially by systematically weakening the subject. This forms part of the classic pattern of manipulation described by the post-Korean War research of Biderman. Biderman was instrumental in debunking the myth that the Chinese had used mysterious or magical means to brainwash the Allied prisoners of war. With Harlow, Farber, and West, and others, he classified manipulative techniques according to a scheme known as DDD, which stands for Dependency, Debility, and Dread. At the time, the behavior code for POWs expressly forbade any communication with the enemy apart from the name, rank, serial number, and date of birth only required by the Geneva Convention. Yet, without recourse to excessive physical brutality, the Chinese interrogators had managed to extract confessions which were fabrications at least as preposterous as those elicited by the KGB for the 1930s show trials. By applying elementary principles of conditioning theory, Biderman pointed out that under the physical, social, and emotional conditions produced by the introduction of DDD, which once again, folks, stands for, let me look here, Dependency, Debility, and Dread. So he says that conditions produced by the introduction of DDD, compliance could be considered a natural consequence of operation of ordinary principles of human behavior. The following outline of the DDD schema will show how stress patterns can be and are manipulated. The function of debility has been discussed above. The victim, by being deprived in the process of debilitation of food, sleep, and human contact by his torturer, becomes paradoxically dependent on his torturer for these things. The only person who can provide these reliefs is the torturer, and in the induced abnormal environment where deprivation and stress are the norm and other social contacts are withdrawn, the victim becomes dependent on him as the sole source of support. Occasional unpredictable brief respites, when among other things the torturer becomes a sympathetic listener, makes the victim feel obligated towards him. I'm going to pause here for a second, folks, and we're going to go over this paragraph again carefully and compare it to things going on in society today. Okay, so it says here that the process of debilitation of food, sleep, and human contact by his torturer for these things, and this person, the torturer, is the only one that can provide the reliefs for these things, is the torturer, then the induced abnormal environment where deprivation and stress are the norm and other social contacts are withdrawn, that's isolation, folks. That's locking yourselves in your home. Okay? So keep this in mind. The people who are telling you right now there's this terrible pandemic, they're using this fear factor to control you. They're telling you need to stay in your house, isolate. Don't go to your relatives for Thanksgiving. Don't talk to your friends or your family. Don't see them. Stay isolated in your home. And right now people are depending upon a government check, like an unemployment check and stuff in many cases, to sustain themselves. So these are the ones that are sustaining, allowing you to sustain yourself. So this is the equivalent of the torturer here when it comes down to it. The state is giving you just enough so that you could survive, giving you just what you need. Just comply, wear the mask, stay indoors, stay in your house, don't visit your relatives, don't do this, don't do that, and it'll be okay. We'll give you another stimulus check. Listen to this. This is what's going on. Okay? This is what's going on. We're being psychologically manipulated in a sense that Amnesty International considers to be torture. When you look at this stuff, think about it for a minute. Think about it logically. So, and if they're telling you, like, the only means that you could purchase your food is if you stay home, we'll give you an unemployment check, or we'll give you the universal basic income, which is coming, folks. Watch for that. Then you'll be totally dependent upon government for everything, for your very existence. And if they're the ones that make you dependent on them, you need them to survive. And they may not be all bad. Like every once in a while, they might throw you a bone. Like, here's a free Obama phone. Or, you know what? This pandemic is so bad, but you know what? We're going to ease up the restrictions for a couple of months in the summertime. Go out and have a little bit of fun. And then we'll lock you back down in the fall. Think about it. What's going on? What's going on around us? But anyway, enough of my little asides here. Let's get back into this. Where did we leave off? Right here. Okay. Just as debilitation leads to dependency, dependency leads to dread. Dread may not be consciously experienced during the application of the debilitation, but during the respites, with the fear of returning to this debilitation torture. The induction of dread is a basic aim. I'm taking an aside here, folks, again. That's what I was just talking about. They let the restrictions and stuff ease up in the summertime, and everybody had this dread, they're going to lock down again. They're going to be locking down again. Guess what? They're locking down again, because this is the roadmap, folks. This is exactly what they're doing. This is the game plan that they're using on us all. So let's continue the reading here, because this gets very telling. Okay, where are we at here? Dread may not be consciously experienced during the application of the debilitation, but during the respites with the fear of returning to this debilitation torture. The induction of dread is a basic aim. To quote Farber et al., dread is the most expressive term to indicate the chronic fear the communists attempted to induce. Communists, folks, listen to that. Fear of death, fear of pain, fear of non-repatriation, fear of deformity or permanent disability through neglect or inadequate medical treatment, fear of communist violence against loved ones at home, and even fear of one's own ability to satisfy the demands of insatiable interrogators. These and many other nagging despairs constituted the final component of DDD. The combination of these three factors, carefully contrived and nurtured, prepares a resistant prisoner for complete compliance. It should be stressed here that complete compliance may mean a whole range of subservient actions, by no means restricted to the popular misconception that the aim of result of coercion is disclosure of true subversive information. In fact, the whole process of extracting confessions, whether true or false, or softening up political suspects, is simply a ruthless teaching procedure. The radically changed context of the torture situation produces new responses that either compete with or interfere with habitual behavior. The coercive stresses seriously affect one's customary ways of looking at and dealing with oneself. They operate in part to produce a state of over-arousal by disturbing the feeling of inner and external security and stability, thereby rendering the prisoner susceptible to relatively simple conditioning techniques, and by channeling the normal need to talk to relieve stress so that only certain conversation patterns, e.g. confessions, are allowed and therefore have to be used by the prisoner. Let's take a pause here, folks. You hear that? Only certain conversation patterns. Oh, I don't know. What would that be? Would that be the newspeak that Orwell spoke of? Would that be political correctness that we're speaking of now? This whole race baiting thing going on, where all of this stuff going on in society today. You dare not say the wrong thing to somebody. I'm offended. That's what that's talking about. And guess what? Social media is the tool they're using to change all this, to try to get you to comply to these certain conversation patterns, okay? Do you see where this is going and how this works yet? Let's continue on. The coercive situation contains features both of selective or instrumental learning, as well as classical conditioning. It produces selective reinforcement or certain modes of response. Critical to this entire procedure is the fact that the treatment is constantly varied. There is usually no regular or uniform sequence to the particular coercive techniques. There is no time when a prisoner can be sure that he is through with a particular ordeal. Doesn't that sound familiar? He can be hauled out at any time and reinterrogated, often a mere cover for getting the prisoner into the habit of compliance in talking. In addition, alleviation of the stress, whether due to spontaneous factors or deliberate manipulations, is intermittent, temporary, and unpredictable. Hence, relief of hunger, fatigue, isolation, or pain, even temporarily, serves as a reward, as do occasional favors, promises, and bonuses for partial compliance. You can go and sleep now and we'll start again tomorrow, all of which provide positive motivation for final compliance, hinder adjustment to the suffering, and speed up the onset of the chronic stress response. The reduction of stress at the time of the occurrence of desired behavior has a second consequence, the learning of instrumental acts, often of a verbal nature. Since verbal behavior is a general way already strongly conditioned in all human adults as a mean of relieving stress or denying its potency, it is not surprising that prisoners should respond to cues of this basically socialized nature. Some prisoners become victims of the very socialization process that under ordinary circumstances is regarded as a desirable and indeed essential aspect of civilized living. A simple example of this was noted by Burns in POW studies, the stress of refusing to answer questions. In everyday situations, it is taken for granted that questions will be answered if they are civil questions, and as frequently as not, even if they are uncivil ones. Many U.S. POWs found that the ingrained pattern of civility made it difficult for them to decline outright to answer a question. It was not that they could not decline, but merely that the refusal required continuous effort, which in the long run they could not sustain. Furthermore, if it becomes clear that the victim is only sustaining himself by his hatred of his imprisoners, he will suddenly find himself being well treated or having his aggression discussed in psychotherapy groups until he is made to feel guilty about feeling aggressive. When he is returned to a punishment situation, he finds that his aggressive feelings induce reflex guilt, and so he abandons them or turns his aggression either outwardly against his fellow captives or inwardly, becoming depressed or anxious. These analyses of conditioning techniques used by interrogators make it evident that gross acts of torture, such as electric shock, rape, or tearing out fingernails, are situated within a coercive context of which such methods are merely an extension. The accompanying chart prepared by Biderman is by no means exhaustive of coercive methods, and it does not include the excessive physical abuse which many forms of torture employ. However, It demonstrates the essential character of stress manipulation and may perhaps, by virtue of its more benign content, reveal the intentions and results of torture with a precision that is almost impossible to achieve when dealing with those massive assaults in which pain and disorientation are compressed. The victim is trapped in a situation in which the stresses are manipulated so as constantly to frustrate this need to behave in a consistent learned behavioral pattern and in accordance with esteemed self-image, both of which are necessary for the protection of basic self-identity. All right, gonna pause here, folks. We're going to look at this next section, and some of you may have seen this posted on Facebook recently. This is called Biderman's Chart of Coercion. And there's 8 different things listed on this chart here, and this is right here on the next page, on page 53 of this book from Amnesty International, The Report on Torture, Revised Edition. This printing was 1975. This was initially released in 1973. General method, number 1. We'll look at the chart here. General method, isolation, effects or purposes, deprives victims of all social support, of his ability to resist, develops an intense concern with self, makes victim dependent upon interrogator. Variants of this, complete solitary confinement, complete isolation, semi-isolation, or group isolation. Method number 2, monopolization of perception. The effects of this fixes attention upon immediate predicament, fosters introspection, eliminates stimuli competing with those controlled by the captor, frustrates all actions not consistent with compliance. And let's look at variants of this. Physical isolation, darkness or bright light, barren environment, restricted movement, monotonous food. Or I would add to this, are you wearing your mask? Did you wear your mask today? Were you able to get in the store? Did they ask you when you got to the store, where's your mask? Did you put on your mask? Did you comply with that? Did you turn on the news today? Did you happen to see, were they talking about this horrible pandemic going on right now and how many people are getting sick with this and how, how many are dying and how ill they are, even though you go out in your community and you don't see this going on? And how the hospitals are starting to get overrun and this and that, but you go out in your environment and you don't see this going on, but they're telling you this on the TV. That's all monopolization of perception. That's right there. That's number 2 on Biderman's chart. Let's move on here. Number 3, induced debility exhaustion. The effects of that weakens mental and physical ability to resist. Variants of this, semi-starvation, exposure, exploitation of wounds, induced illness, sleep deprivation, prolonged constraint, prolonged interrogation, forced writing, overexertion. You see that? Prolonged constraint, that would be isolating in your house for too long without any, going to the outside world. Induced illness, which, we could kind of see that going on. But anyway, let's move on to point number 4 here. General method number 4, threats. And the effects of stress cultivates anxiety and despair. Variants of this, threats of death, threats of non-return, threats of endless interrogation and isolation, threats against family, vague threats, mysterious changes of treatment. So threats of, there's this killer disease out here, and if you go out without your mask on and don't social distance properly and actually go out and breathe and walk around like a normal human being, you could maybe get your grandmother sick and she'll die. That's threats, folks. That's number 4 on Biderman's chart of coercion right here. Let's move on. Number 5, occasional indulgences. The effects of this provides positive motivation for compliance, hinders adjustment to deprivation. And let's see, variants of this, occasional favors, fluctuations of interrogators' attitudes, promises, rewards for partial compliance, and tantalizing. So, like, say, you wear your mask. Oh, we flattened the curve here, so we could, ease the restrictions a little bit for the summertime. And then once the fall rolls around, we put the hammer down again. Don't we see that going on? Occasional indulgence. They let you have a little bit of fun this past summer, but now they're gearing up for their quote-unquote dark winter. So you'll see now they're going to start hammering back down and let their true colors come out. Number 6 on the general methods here. Demonstrating omnipotence the effects suggest futility of resistance. Variants of this: confrontation, pretending cooperation taken for granted, demonstrating complete control over victim's fate. Listen to the experts. Listen to the experts. The experts know best. And didn't Dr. Fauci just come out and say, listen, shut up and listen, put on your mask, stay inside? Didn't he just come out and say something to that effect? That we need to just follow their orders? That's what this is, folks. They're trying to demonstrate omnipotence, like they know everything there is to know, and you best listen to them because they know what's best for you. This is what we're looking at. So far, I think we're 6 for 6 on the list, aren't we, of all the things? Because the first one was isolation. I mean, it's, that goes without saying how everybody's been, locked up on lockdowns in their house, and you can't go do your normal stuff, and it's hard to meet with people. So that was the first one. We'll review when we're done with all 8 of these here. But let's move on to number 7. I don't want to get too muddled up here. Number 7, degradation. In the effects of that, makes cost of resistance appear more damaging to self-esteem than capitulation, reduces prisoners to animal-level concerns. Variants of this: personal hygiene prevented, filthy infested surroundings, demeaning punishments, insults and taunts, denial of privacy. And I would add, or you might get kicked out of the grocery store. So here it is. Degradation. We could see this. We could see things, demeaning punishments, insults and taunts. You could, if you own a business and you won't comply with their rules, you could get fined and shut down. Insults and taunts. You go out, you get called a filthy anti-masker. Put on your mask. You grandma killer. Here it is. Okay, so we're 7 for 7 so far. Let's look at number 8. Number 8, general method: enforcing trivial demands. And the effects of that is to develop a habit of compliance. And some variants they list here: forced writing, enforcement of minute rules. Wear your mask. Make sure you're social distancing properly. Wash your hands. Use hand sanitizer. Think about it. So let's do a quick review here. Number 1, isolation. We see that when we're, locked in our homes for weeks at a time, can't go out unless it's for what they call essential business or whatever. But still, same thing. That's a form of isolation. Number 2, monopolization of perception. They control the airwaves, the media. They tell you what you're supposed to believe. And, they try to control what you think and try to frustrate all your actions if you're not in compliance with them. That's monopolization of compliance, or of perception, sorry. Number 3 is induced debility, exhaustion, to weaken the mental and physical ability to resist. And this is, done by prolonged lockdowns or prolonged restrictions on your ability to live life normally. Number 4, threats. Well, we saw this. We demonstrated that. Threats of death. If you go out without your mask, you might catch the COVID and die or kill your grandmother. And you might not even know you have it. It's this remarkable thing. You may not know you have it, and you could pass it on. Number 5, occasional indulgences. Could see how they allowed the easing up of some restrictions for a certain period of time, only to take back those privileges that they now gave us. Number 6, demonstrating omnipotence. We see that again. You have these quote-unquote experts, and everybody seems to bow down to these quote-unquote experts that are telling you what to do and that you must comply. Number 7, degradation. You get insulted on a regular basis if you don't comply. That's what this is about. And number 8, enforcing trivial demands. I can't think of any more trivial demand than having to wear a stupid face mask that does nothing. You would have more of a chance of keeping mosquitoes out of your yard by building a chain link fence than to prevent a virus from getting through a mask. They don't do anything positive at all. There's been numerous scientific studies to show that it does not make one lick of difference, and if anything, it only promotes more illness rather than protect you from it. So those are the eight general methods on Biderman's chart of coercion, direct from Amnesty International's report on torture, 1973. Let's continue on. We're almost done here. Bear with me for just a little longer, folks. I think we're making the points we want to make, and you could see why I wanted to do this tonight. To shield and to reassure himself that he is in control of the situation and of himself, the victim may finally resort to self-defeating behavior. A frequent statement of this self-defeating behavior, we said that already, we got there. A frequent statement of this defense is, I decided to give in while I still had my wits about me and could control what they got out of me, rather than waiting until they had broken me completely. Such behavior leads one to consider the possibilities for resistance to stressful coercion. In its study of forceful indoctrination methods, the Group for the Advancement of Psychiatry cited a number of reasons for resistance, among them moral and duty obligations, altruistic calculations in terms of the interest of the movement or cause, and the interest of fellow prisoners, self-interested calculations in terms of fear of getting in deeper and deeper, fear of penalization by former comrades or other prisoners, for collaboration, emotional considerations including the feeling of pride, dignity, and self-respect, hatred of the enemy or of the specific individuals inflicting the stress, and a sense of outrage or righteous indignation. It should be noted, of course, that if bodily well-being is maintained, it is easier to resist psychological stresses, and the extent to which one is aware of latent anxieties and tensions within oneself will reduce the ability of the interrogator to use unadmitted fears or guilt as a covert force toward compliance. Despite efforts made in South Africa, for example, to train activists in interrogation torture resistance, there are obvious limitations. Biderman concludes, it would be foolish to disregard the fact that some of the elements of DDD represent a pathological organic state, some consequences of which are probably innately determined. To the extent that this is true, one cannot expect to achieve a great degree of prophylactic success in regard to the effects of DDD, any more than one can reasonably expect at the present state of knowledge to prevent some of the undesirable consequences of lobotomy. Though many of the behavioral consequences of DDD are not innately determined, the conditioning of certain types of responses desired by the enemy, many eventually occur, even in the face of superlative resistance. Before proceeding to a discussion of the injury which stress may cause and specific injuries associated with common practices, it is important to point out here the use of the use of pharmaceuticals in the torture interrogation situation. Okay, we're going to end it right there, folks, because the next section in this book talks about pharmacological torture, and that's a discussion for a whole other day. But let's just go back through what we had just read here. There's one part in particular that I wanted to point out. In its study of forceful indoctrination methods, the Group for the Advancement of Psychiatry cited a number of reasons for resistance. Well, first of all, studying forceful indoctrination methods, this group calls themselves the Group for Advancement of Psychiatry. Why are these people studying something as subversive as forceful indoctrination methods? Think about that. Does this sound like a psychiatry group you would want to have any business with? I don't think so. But they talk about these different reasons why people would not want to comply. And then they go on to state here, it should be noted, of course, that if bodily well-being is maintained, it is easier to resist psychological stresses, and the extent to which one is aware of latent anxieties and tensions within oneself will reduce the ability of the interrogator to use unadmitted fears or guilt as covert force towards compliance. So they're saying here, if you're healthy and well, and you're doing well bodily, physically, you have a much greater chance of resisting these psychological efforts. That's why they want everybody sick, folks. Why do you think they're pushing this whole vaccine thing so hard? They want everybody sick. They want to double down on this. They want everybody to be mentally and physically broken so that they will comply with what these people want, with their ridiculous demands. But that's one of the reasons why they're pushing this whole concept. And then I find it eerily, coincidental that the next section of this book here talks about pharmacological torture. So that should be the clue to you guys. Where's this going next? So that's kind of where we stand right now. I just wanted to point out we're living under a torture program, guys. Let's make it clear in no uncertain terms. They're using a soft form of torture on all of society right now. And people can't admit it to themselves. And that's all part of the torture. That they, these people, their minds are broken to the point they don't recognize what is being done to them by these people in positions of power. Specifically, these ones that are really quarterbacking this whole thing from the topmost places. Places like the World Economic Forum, places like, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, places like Johns Hopkins University, places like the CDC, the World Health Organization, the World Bank, all of these big players, corporations like Google, all of these places, they have their hands in this. The Vatican also plays a role in this. And I think the key player right now we need to keep our eyes on in all of this is the World Economic Forum that is coming out with their plan called the Great Reset. And, they're equating this to COVID-19, the Great Reset. And they're touting this heavily, and they're not hiding anything. This is the New World Order, folks. This is what they're doing. That's what they're using this for. They want to achieve this New World Order they've been talking about for years. All of us, conspiracy-minded folks that everybody used to laugh at us and say, oh, put on your tinfoil hat. They're all walking around wearing these masks, locking themselves in their houses, and they're the ones that are just being led like sheep to the slaughter. And we need to speak up, speak out about this, let people know. This is not okay. This cannot stand. This is not morally correct. Anybody out there who, would have any shred of common sense whatsoever would be able to tell you, this cannot stand. This is not proper. This is not moral. This is not right. And we need to stand up and say no to this because it's getting ridiculous, and they just keep pushing it along further and further and further until people will comply to the most ridiculous demands. And we see it going on around us, and the most ridiculous suggestions. Like right now, they're suggesting that there could be another shortage of toilet paper. Guess what? People are buying up the toilet paper and creating this shortage themselves because they put that suggestion in there. This is a test. They use that kind of a thing as a test to see where the social mindset is, where the public consciousness is. So they could see just how much further they could push it, what they could get away with right now. And that's what they use. They use something like that as a measuring stick for this. It's a test to see how compliant the people are going to be. Will they be compliant this second wave like they were the first wave, or are they going to get more blowback? They're testing the waters with that right now. We need to stand up and be strong right now and say, no, we're not going to let you do this. We've had enough of this. If this was really an actual thing that was going on, if there was a true pandemic going on, okay, everywhere I've gone, I've been, about for the entire past 8 months, everywhere I've gone without wearing a face mask, I was the only one without a face mask anywhere I went, with the exception of maybe a handful of times that I've seen where there was another person or two in the store without a mask, or where I was at without a mask. But for the most part, people have been compliant this whole time. And yet they still have this second wave. So that tells me that the ridiculous demands that they made for us to do in order to, quote-unquote, flatten the curve, they didn't work. They do not work. So doing it a second time is insanity because, that's the very definition of insanity. To do something again the same time you did it last time and expect a different result. It's not going to change anything. So we need to stand up and say, no, we're not going to comply to your tyranny, because that's what this is. This is about control. This is not about health. This is not about an illness. It's not about a pandemic. It's about control, and it's about their Great Reset and the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Keep an eye on the World Economic Forum. Keep an eye on the World Bank. Watch for anything that talks about the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Watch for this stuff. It's coming, folks, and they're using this as their means to get there. So we need to stand up, be loud, be obnoxious if you have to with this stuff. We need to get people to actually, open their eyes and see that this agenda has nothing to do with their health, nothing to do with their well-being. These people don't give a crap if you're healthy or not. They don't give a crap. They could care less. They want you to die. They have open plans for depopulation. And this is one of the ways they're going to go about rolling that out, because this all ties in to their Fourth Industrial Revolution and their New World Order and their Great Reset and the transhumanist plan. And that's what this is. It all ties together. So just keep your eyes open for this. And do what you can. Try and make people aware that this is not right, and we need to just collectively, as a unified front, as the common people, to say no and not comply to their ridiculous demands, because if we do, they're going to roll over us, and the end is not going to be good then. But if we stand up in massive enough numbers, then their whole house of cards is going to fall. And that's what we need to do. So we need to spread awareness of this, spread the information around, and just keep your heads held high. And, make sure you're right with your maker, folks. That's all I could tell you. Because I think we're in for some tough times here. And we just need to hold on to our integrity and just do our best to resist this. Because not resisting this is going to be worse than if we do resist it. So just want people to know that this stuff is going on, and that basically we're being psychologically tortured by those in control in government circles and these different, health agencies and things like that. And they're doing it on purpose, and they're fully aware of what they're doing. Make no bones about that. The ones at the top of the power structure, they know. They know what they're doing. Now, many of those on the front lines, at the bottom of the structure are just doing what they think is right. And we can't fault those people for doing what they think is right. But most of them are unaware that things like this even go on. So we need to make the awareness spread far and wide out there so people know. We're living in an information age, and people are more ignorant than ever before of things that they should know stuff about. Oh, we're a highly entertained society, for sure. But most people on the street, they don't have a clue about any of this stuff. So when you look at this, share this chart around with people so people could understand. This is a type of psychological torture, and they're using it to, get compliance from us so that we just will follow their marching orders no matter how ridiculous they are. So anyway, I've rambled on long enough, folks. So thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you later. Like and subscribe.